Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you happen to be watching this video. I will have a couple of videos this week. We'll work in the future to make sure I get videos up early for your viewing in preparation for class. Each week I will try to post some material ahead of time so you can prepare for class, and we will actually focus our classroom energy on primary source reading, discussion, and engagement, to flesh out what we learn in the reading, in the lecture, and then also to diversify and broaden our understanding of the period by bringing in voices that aren't always heard and emphasized. By way of beginning our conversation today, let me start with an introductory idea. In addition to teaching you stuff that happened, I oftentimes like also to provide concepts, interpretive devices that are helpful as we think about the Christian past. And the idea that I want to start with today is this idea of streams that culminate in the present versus presentism. Let me explain what I mean by that. You will hear today numerous, dozens of truths about the Christian past that will shed light on why Christian religion in America is like it is today. So many influences from our colonial past will help you make sense out of the contours of the present practice of religion and Christianity. At the same time, we have to recognize, as historian Carl Becker repeated from a novel by L.P. Hartley, that the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So we want to see the past as informing our present, helping us understand where we came from, while at the same time recognizing that the past has to be understood on its own terms. The danger of only looking at how the past informs the present is what we call presentism, which is dangerous because of triumphalism. The 19th century Germans that eventually resulted in the mindset that gave us the Third Reich actually had this idea that history culminates in me, right? History culminates in me, and therefore we have to make sure that we both look for influence to the present and understand the past on its own terms, and I'll try to get that balance as we go about our lecture today. I want to start by just reminding us of a couple of things. We talked about Catholicism in New Spain and Catholic missions in New France last week. Just a reminder that Catholics in New Spain had a conquest mentality, and then the Catholic missions in France, while there were small-scale explorations by Jesuits and other mendicant priests that did not quite have that dominance model, where we did see a more dominant Catholic culture was in Quebec, in Canada, but there were also religious diversity throughout the colonies of the French Calvinists or the Huguenots. The Edict of Nantes in 1598 actually gave them a measure of liberty, and it was those folks, many of them, who wound up in the New World, some of them settling in what is today New Orleans, and eventually led to that Creole culture that we understand in that part of the country. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get on into religion in the southern colonies. Today's focus is going to be on New England and the middle colonies. We'll have a deep focus on the Puritans for a whole series of important reasons, but we'll also talk about some of the other groups that came to dominate and practice in the colonies, in colonial America. And first, who I want to mention is the rise of Catholicism in what is today Maryland. In contrast to what happened in Quebec, where steady support for the church and state led to a deeply rooted Catholic culture, settlement in Maryland was much more haphazard and never quite as deeply organized. The picture there you see is of George Calvert, 1580 to 1632, and his son Cecil were the first and second Lords Baltimore, and they founded Maryland. They founded Maryland and came to the New World in the 1640s. George Calvert actually converted from from Protestantism to Catholicism in 1625, and he was Secretary of State under James I of England, but he was forced to resign when he refused to swear allegiance to the Church of England. And upon James's death, especially under the rise of Charles I, which was the re-Protestantizing of England. I'll give a little bit more details about the English Reformation and that succession of kings and what they thought a little bit later in the lecture. Suffice it to say that at this particular point, at one point under James I, it was good to be Catholic, and then when he was succeeded by Charles I, it was bad to be Catholic in England. But the new Protestant king, Charles I, actually wanted to repay the Calverts for their loyal service to the throne for multiple generations. So he provided a proprietary land grant in the New World to provide a haven for Catholics and to increase the family fortune in the New World. And so the Calverts and others and other Catholics immigrated to the New World, and they were only so successful, and it wasn't a long-term lived experiment. Catholic missionaries also came to work among the Native Americans. A very famous missionary by the name of Andrew White, who came in the 1650s, stirred up the Protestants and caused a lot of opposition. And in our primary source reading today, we'll talk a little bit about why it was that Protestants in this particular period were so fearful and anti-Catholic. In 1649, they passed the Act of in 1649, they passed the Act Concerning Religion. And in that act an act concerning religion, they moved in the direction of religious toleration. And this is what's important to understand, is that they had a primarily Catholic but tolerant society where you were allowed to be both Protestant and Catholic. The key here is to recognize that in that movement toward toleration, this is roughly a new idea. Coming out of the Reformation and into the early modern period in Europe, religion was always tied to geography and to government. One group was Catholic, another group was Protestant, and down the line with respect to some religious diversity among various Protestant groups. The idea that two people could occupy the same land and have different religion, well, this is a pretty new idea, and one that is central to the American mindset and the American psyche, and one of the first ways that you see it happening early on is in 1649 with the Act Concerning Religion in Maryland. In 1691, the land was stripped from the Calvert family, made into a national colony, and then eventually it was returned in 1715. And in fact, Maryland remained a proprietary colony for the Calvert family all the way up until the American Revolution. Out of Maryland, you get the first Catholic bishop in the United States, and it became the center of American Catholicism well into the 19th century in American life. So understanding the Calvert and the Maryland story is essential to understand some of the religious diversity that expressed itself in the United States. But our focus today, I think, will be on the New England Puritans. But in order to get there, we have to tell a little bit of backstory about the English Reformation. What was going on in England at the time that created the context for these people jumping on boats and sailing across the Atlantic and settling in North America. From your church history class, the second one where you did a story of the Reformation, I'm assuming you all have basic understanding of the Reformation and how it took root in England. You'll remember that Henry VIII, when the Pope wouldn't give him a divorce because his wife wouldn't give him a male heir, basically just thumbed his nose at the papacy and created his own church, the Church of England, and thus the beginnings of the English Reformation. After his death, Henry VIII was succeeded by Edward VI, who died in 1553 and was then succeeded by his half-sister, Mary Tudor, otherwise remembered in history derogatorily as Bloody Mary. During her rule, in the 1550s, almost 300 Protestants went to the flames for their convictions and their Protestant beliefs as she attempted to re-Catholicize England. The result was a group of people we call the Marian Exiles. These English Protestants who fled England during that time went primarily to places like Switzerland and Germany for a period of time. 5 years later, in 1558, Mary died, and she was succeeded by Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth I. Those Marian exiles, those English refugees returned home as Elizabeth sought to create a settlement that was primarily Catholic in practice, high religion. It kind of looked like Catholicism on a service, but Protestant theology as that basic understanding of how the Reformation took shape into the late 16th century in England. As they sought to create this balance of high church, Catholic-looking religious practice and Protestant theology, there arose a group of people in England that became known as the Puritans. The Puritans wanted purity of church practice. They believed that religion should wipe out all vestiges of Roman Catholic belief and practice. And they sought to, what they understood to do was to complete the Reformation, to make the Reformation actually worth something, to bring it to its logical conclusion and root out Catholic belief and practice altogether. It was these folks, many of them, because they saw that they could not bring the Reformation to its logical conclusion, that came to New England, the Massachusetts Bay Puritans in the 1630s, to complete the work of the Puritans who were trying to complete the English Reformation. Their desire also was one of biblicism. They wanted to strictly follow the Bible. So I thought I would take a minute here to just recognize that Puritanism, in addition to being a religious movement, was also a political movement. In fact, once you get into the latter part of the 17th century, once you get into the 17th century, they fight a gigantic English civil war, and it's the Puritans who actually gather to challenge the throne. And out of that comes a new understanding and a new commitment to parlaying in Parliament and things like that. So that's a story to be told another day, but Puritanism was both a political and a religious movement. To the extent that it was a religious movement, we recognize that there are, we could talk an awful long time about this, but I thought I would articulate 4 key Puritan beliefs. Number 1 was that humans were entirely dependent upon God for salvation. They were Calvinist. They were Reformed. They had an emphasis on conversion as a moment in time whereby you make a decision to follow God. That was actually maybe a little bit presentist. They weren't quite that conversionist. That was really more of a 19th century phenomenon. But they emphasized the importance of conversion and clean, healthy, obedient living before God. But it was God who made that possible, and humans responded to that invitation because it was God indeed who was sovereign over the process of human salvation. The second is that they had a strong emphasis on the authority of the Bible. In fact, they had this basic idea that you do only what the Scriptures explicitly tell you to do. This is really versus the Lutheran view that you may have come across at some point in church history that says that you can do anything you want as long as Scripture doesn't forbid it. One is more open and freeing, the other is much more didactic. And the Puritans strongly believed that if the Bible doesn't dictate it, you don't do it. So, for example, they didn't celebrate Christmas, right? That was a cultural thing. It wasn't a biblical thing. Some took this particular belief all the way. We call them Baptists, like Roger Williams. We'll talk a little bit more about him later, who eventually separated the church and state entirely. But this was not the foot forward for the Puritans. They did not completely separate the church from the state. Neither were they theocratic. They had a balance between the two. We'll talk about that when we get to a section on the Puritan way. Third, they believed that God created society as a uniform and a unified whole. Church and state, the individual and the public, are never fully independent from one another, but they are related spheres of life. They complement one another all to the end that people live lives of obedience before God and one another. Thus, they sought to reform all of society. So not only did they have theological beliefs that affected the church, but they led to renovations and revisions in education. They believed in universal literacy. the rise of science, exploration, immigration. They were engaging, embracing people who looked at the world much more broadly. And fourth, they believed that God always worked with humanity through covenants. The original covenant was between God and Adam. It was revised under Moses. It was succeeded by the one with Jesus. As a result of that, we are saved by a covenant of grace, initiated by God and confirmed by individual Christians. So God is the one who covenants with us. Key here to understand, right? God also covenants not only with individuals in salvation, but God covenants with nations. And when the nation is obedient to God, you prosper. And if the nation is not obedient to God, you fail. If you want to understand the basis of contemporary Christian nationalism, it reaches all the way back to this national sentiment, and we will talk a little bit about this both in John Winthrop's Model of Christian Charity, as well as William Bradford's document in early Puritan Pilgrim Plymouth Plantation. This idea that we're in a national covenant with God. Finally, we also covenant with each other, right? Covenants go both vertically and horizontally. We covenant with God as individuals and as a group of people to honor God and then get blessing if we honor God, and we covenant with one another to make sure that we have the rules, regulations, laws, and perspectives that make life together possible. This concept of covenant is actually essential. Before I go on any further in my conversation about the Puritans, I did want to make one distinction for you that I do believe is important, and that is the distinction between what we call separating and non-separating Puritans. The separating Puritans were the more radical of the two, and they believed actually that the church should fully separate from popular culture and go out on its own. This is rather simplified but basic, right? These were the Puritans of Plymouth Plantation. The 1620 Pilgrims were separatists, right? Creating their own society. Whereas the dominant mode in Massachusetts were the Massachusetts Bay Pilgrims of 1630. They were non-separating Puritans. They actually sought to reform the Church of England to turn it into everything that it was intended to be without fully leaving it behind and separating from it. It was these particular folks who eventually got on boats and came over to the New World with a new idea about reforming it and creating a new society. The group that we want to emphasize, and we'll spend a lot more of our time talking today, is actually the 1630 Massachusetts Bay Puritans who arrived on board the Arbella. And imagine, even before they got off the boat, they sat there on the boat in Boston Harbor. Actually, it was near Salem at the time, in Salem. And before they were allowed to get off the boat, they had to listen to John Winthrop give a long sermon, the Model of Christian Charity. We'll read that as a primary source and discuss it in class this week. The Great Puritan Migration to the New World took place when it appeared that opportunities for genuine reform in England were closed off from this group of deeply reform-minded Calvinist Christians. Charles I, who succeeded James I, had Roman Catholic tendencies, and he eventually tried to rule England without Parliament. And that Parliament, by the way, was increasingly dominated by Puritans, which eventually led to a quite brutal civil war. In 1628, a group of Puritans who were leaning towards congregational church governance, independent churches who related to one another, purchased controlling interest in a trading company, the Massachusetts Bay Trading Company, that had been previously set up exclusively as a profit-making venture. In 1630, they took their first trip to Massachusetts Bay, and the rest, as they say, is history. But it's important to recognize for our purposes is to know that there were folks who were already here, right? In the first decade of the 17th century, there were settlers in Virginia, as the Virginia Company of London, focused primarily on profit, arrived in what is today Jamestown, Virginia. We know the story of John Rolfe and Pocahontas, of the understanding of Native American conversion and of indigenous culture that was brought to England and Europe as we started to interact with indigenous people in North America. And again, all the way from the beginning, the key staple crop in Virginia was tobacco, right? An emphasis on American mission to the Native American and tobacco. That's an important story to tell. We'll read a little bit about it today in our primary sources, but you got that from the textbook, and it's not going to be the focus of our primary conversation tonight. The other group that was already here were the Plymouth Puritans, who arrived 10 years earlier in what is now right at the base of Cape Cod. Having given up on reforming English society, this group of separating Puritans was focused on setting up an independent, separate society for themselves. Because James I, after Elizabeth, did not embrace the Puritan cause, they left for Holland in order to worship as they pleased and create an ideal society of their own. William Bradford was their chronicler. You see his picture here. He was actually the first governor as well. And they worried in Holland that their children were being corrupted by other faiths as they intermarried with Dutch Protestants and others and Catholics in the Netherlands. So they eventually secured a sponsorship from English merchants in the Virginia Company, and they sailed for the New World. Right, so this was a joint venture, a religious desire to create an ideal society, and a business venture to get a foothold in the colonial New World and bring resources and wealth back to England through the Virginia Company. They set sail for Virginia. In fact, when you read some of their early documents, they'll say, and we landed in the northern reaches of Virginia. Of course, they were way off. They got blown off track. They wound up in what is today Massachusetts. It's either in Truro or Eastham, somewhere like that, out on Cape Cod. You'll see a... sorry, my dog just came in here for a visit. In Truro or Eastham, there's actually First Encounter Beach. They actually wound up on Cape Cod first with one of their little boats from the three, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, and they looked a little bit around. Lord have mercy on my soul. Okay, I just actually gave the name of Columbus's ships. This is what happened when you work off script. But when they came along the Mayflower, for goodness sake, Kurt, get your story straight, they took a little skiff and did some coastal exploration, and they landed first on what is now First Encounter Beach in Cape Cod. They set sail for Virginia, wound up in Massachusetts, and their reception was absolutely brutal. The first winter, half of them died. And then because of the heroism of a group of people like Miles Standish, William Brewster, William Bradford, and others, they pulled themselves together through discipline and mutual dependence, and they eventually got more settlers, and they got resources and provisions from England that arrived the next spring, and they eventually created a permanent settlement that was absorbed into Massachusetts Bay years later. As a way of talking about that Puritan mindset, before we get a whole lot further, I wanted to read a little section with you that has become known as the Mayflower Compact. When you do American history, when you look at an American History Museum, one of the very first documents that you will read is the Mayflower Compact. This was a document that all those who were settling in Plymouth actually wrote and signed together. And it looks like this. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith and the honor of our King and country, voyaged to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. So pause there for just a minute. They undertook this for the glory of God, number one, for the advancement of the Christian faith, number two, and number three, the honor of king and country. So this was both a religious errand and an empire errand for the emerging English empire. They do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another. Now here's the key language, I put it in bold. Covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, right? They weren't going to make it. If everybody was fighting on their own and for themselves and not collaborating and cooperating together, they had to cooperate and have mutual love in a civil arrangement. And so they covenant not only with God vertically, but with each other horizontally. And then they said, part of this agreement is you've got to buy in because we're going to constitute and frame laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers as we thought most need and convenient for the general good of the colony, and we're all going to submit to it. This is one of the world's, since the ancient world of Greece, the early modern and coming into the colonial period, root document for what became known as democracy, right? So this is both a religious and a political statement, and important for us to understand about what religion looked like in the New World. Well, with that as a background, I'm going to stop this particular lecture, and then the next one I will focus primarily on the New England way, what happened in New England, and what were some of the alternatives to Puritan religion in New England and in the colonies in the 17th century. And I look forward to meeting you there. And then I will end that next lecture with a little conversation about the primary sources we will discuss in class on Tuesday. See you soon.